Amara's heart beat fast as the car rolled through the tall iron gates of her husband's family mansion in Nwaffer. The compound was wide, with trimmed flowers along the driveway, and a fountain that glittered under the afternoon sun. She pressed her palm against her chest, whispering a quiet prayer. Her Ankara gown was bright yellow with deep blue patterns, hugging her gracefully, and her geli sat perfectly on her head. She had dreamed of this moment since the day she said yes to Chaik. In her mind, marriage was the beginning of love, laughter, and a new family that would embrace her like their own daughter. As she stepped out of the car, she looked around in awe at the grand building. Marble pillars, wide balconies, and the scent of roasted groundnuts coming from a nearby stall in the street mixed into the air. She smiled, imagining herself waking up here every day, cooking in the family kitchen, sharing meals and building memories. She clutched her small handbag and walked toward the door, her heart full of joy and hope. In that moment, Amara believed she was walking into acceptance, not knowing that behind those tall walls waited trials that would test every bit of her strength. Do you want me to now expand scene 2? The cold welcome, 200 words, in the same emotional and conversational style? It was a quiet evening, the kind where the sky turned orange and the compound smelled of roasted yam from the street vendors outside. Amara had just finished arranging her clothes in the wardrobe when she heard loud laughter echoing through the hallway. Curious, she stepped out, her geli loosely tied, her wrapper folded neatly around her waist. She followed the sound and froze when she saw her husband's ex, Chisholm, seated comfortably in the master bedroom, the very room that was meant to be hers as a new wife. Chisholm was leaning back on the bed like she owned it, sipping juice from a tall glass while chatting with Amara's mother-in-law. Amara blinked twice, her heart racing. She thought maybe it was just a mistake, maybe Chisholm had been invited in by accident. But before she could even open her mouth, her mother-in-law looked at her sharply and said, "Amara, you don't need to disturb Chisholm. She will be using this room while she stays here." The words cut deeper than a knife. Amara's lips parted but no sound came out. She felt her chest tighten, her pride crushed into pieces. Finally she managed to whisper, "But this is my room. I am Chaik's wife." Her voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. Her sister-in-law rolled her eyes and replied coldly, "You can stay in the small guest house outside. At least it will be quiet for you there." The others chuckled softly, as though Amara had no right to even question their decision. Her husband was nowhere in sight, and the silence from him hurt more than their insults. Amara's eyes stung with unshed tears as she turned slowly, her hands shaking. The golden curtains of the master bedroom swayed gently behind her, mocking her pain. She carried her small bag, the weight of humiliation heavy on her shoulders, and stepped into the night. With every step toward the abandoned guest house, she felt her heart breaking, but deep inside, a quiet voice told her this was not the end of her story. "Do you want me to now expand S?" Amara carried her small bags under the night sky, the laughter from the big mansion still echoing behind her like a cruel reminder. The compound lights glowed brightly near the main house, but the path toward the guest house was dark and lonely. Her slippers scraped against the rough ground, her steps slow and heavy, as if the earth itself shared her sorrow. The night breeze was cool, yet it did nothing to calm the fire of shame burning in her chest. When she reached the small building at the far end of the compound, her heart sank even further. The door creaked loudly when she pushed it open, as though warning her of the misery inside. Cobwebs hung in every corner, glistening in the moonlight like forgotten scars. The air smelled damp and rotten, mixed with the scent of dust that had been locked in for years. A broken chair leaned helplessly against the wall, and an old mattress lay in one corner, torn open with its foam spilling out. Amara dropped her bags on the floor and sat down, covering her face with both hands. Tears flowed freely now, hot and bitter, blurring her vision. "How did it come to this?" she whispered into the silence. Just days ago she had been a bride full of dreams. Now she was treated like an intruder in her own marriage. Her chest heaved as sobs escaped, and the only response was the sound of crickets chirping outside. But even in her pain, Amara refused to lie down on the torn mattress. She stood slowly, wiped her face and looked around. Her voice was low but firm when she spoke into the darkness. "If they want me here, then here will shine brighter than their mansion." The words came from a place deep inside her, a place that still carried hope. She had been humiliated, but she would not let humiliation be her ending. That night, in the dusty shadows of the guest house, Amara's tears watered the seed of her quiet strength, the strength that would soon shock everyone who doubted her. Do you want me to continue with scene 5, the Sent God to the snick up sich no more fables of silver. No, I recall the safer spell wheel all stood sich. Search time no, the non ideal was to for Roma, and the burn in a vita. The ass lying a burst sticker for nice of snobs or real in it. Speaks the spots said we sesher. Stare him no earn erdution in the gelded ears so we shine. Smears full of flour when a bay show as it's such. Snell ass of the snitter so wish. Says this much it did. And I shiver here. Heard it nita, why nearly 12 series. Snay thought the safer herva. And I that's neural from the sky birth bars drum. Twang lips muffs the thing that no. Her no nails search time bloating in it. Oh, what snake ale silva neilerish nickorba. Sir, you're from it calling the bad side witness of skim. And armed it made lime sir. Sir ox and agrafel el lumen in silk. Her no you're renting a spell back. Yeah, snay resim with her, you know what's it. And I put a chuck be no wheel wild gear road. Herther from the weakness her. Knife mark of an air off with any little bombs that she reach no. Sasher hanging her mesh very often market in the did. Oh, so zero beyond it. Where us her fresh was the 30th visit. Eva no else spetzer. Knife fabrics naked beer sir. And one the cards of slash side get no thigh but the. So I name the new air books the knife market. Her now marvel keller now he knew that let's name given the fruit fella. Ja, stand the na sky bombs are here. Amara sat on the cold cement floor for a long while, listening to the silence around her. The distant music and laughter from the mansion reached her faintly, but here in the small guest house, it felt like another world, a world of rejection. Her tears had dried on her cheeks, leaving faint marks, but her eyes no longer held only sadness. Something inside her had shifted. She took a deep breath, placed her palm over her chest and whispered softly, "If they want me here, then this place will shine brighter than their mansion." The words were quiet, yet they carried the weight of a promise. She stood and began to look around, really look. The broken chair, the cracked walls, the cobwebs hanging low. They no longer seemed like symbols of shame, but like challenges waiting to be defeated. Her pain was still fresh, but it no longer crushed her. Instead, it pushed her to rise. She touched the old window frame, her fingers brushing the dust away, and imagined sunlight pouring through it once the glass was cleaned. She saw flowers in her mind, bright and alive, where now there were only weeds. Amara knew she had no riches, no help from her in-laws, no favor in this house, but she still had her hands, her heart, and her faith. That would be enough. She untied her geli, letting her hair fall freely, and smiled a small, tired smile. For the first time that night, her chest felt a little lighter. She whispered again, this time louder, "This place will be my palace." The crickets outside chirped as if agreeing with her. She picked up her small bag, pulled out a scarf and tied it firmly around her head like a crown. She had been humiliated, but she would not stay broken. In that quiet moment, Amara's determination was born, and it was stronger than any insult they could throw at her. Do you want me to move on and expand scene 6? The transformation begins, 350 words, in this same deep emotional style. The next morning, Amara woke up early, long before the sun rose over Nwaffer. She tied a scarf around her head, rolled up her sleeves, and looked at the little guest house with new eyes. What had seemed like a place of shame last night now looked like an empty canvas. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "We begin today." Her first battle was with the dust. She fetched a bucket of water, soaked an old rag, and wiped the walls until her arms ached. Cobwebs clung to her hair as she swept them down, but she didn't stop. By the time the sun rose fully, sweat dripped down her face. Yet there was a spark of pride in her eyes. The cracks in the wall no longer frightened her. Instead, she saw them as proof of her effort, of her presence. Day by day, she poured herself into the small house. She repainted the walls with soft cream and gold tones, borrowing paint from a local shop and paying in small installments from the little savings she had carried from her village. She scrubbed the floor until it shone, then brought in fresh flowers she picked from the family garden, hibiscus, bougainvillea, and lilies, arranging them in broken clay pots that she cleaned and polished like treasures. Even the old torn mattress was replaced. She sold her few pieces of jewelry at the nearby market and used the money to buy a modest but neat bed. She stitched handmade curtains out of leftover fabric and hung them proudly, watching them dance gently in the breeze. Every single touch carried her heart. The guest house, once dark and lifeless, slowly began to breathe again. When Amara stood at the doorway one evening and looked around, she saw warmth instead of emptiness. It was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming a home, a reflection of her dignity. Though no one else applauded, Amara knew she was building something greater than walls. She was building her strength. And deep down she felt it. This small place would soon outshine the mansion that had rejected her. Within weeks, the guest house no longer looked like the forgotten corner of the compound. It bloomed with a kind of beauty that could only come from love and hard work. Amara's hands had touched every corner, and her heart had poured into every detail. The once torn curtains were replaced with handmade fabric she sewed herself, using bright ochre patterns that danced with color when the sunlight streamed through the windows. She polished the wooden chairs until their dark grain shone, then covered them with cushions she stuffed with cotton from the local market. An old carpenter from the neighborhood helped her carve a small table, and together they added simple designs of flowers along its edges, turning plain wood into art. Golden lamps now stood on either side of her bed, glowing warmly in the evenings and making the little house feel like a place of royalty. Fresh fabrics lined her shelves, folded neatly and smelling of soap. The air that once reeked of rot now carried the sweet scent of hibiscus and lavender, from the flowers she picked daily and arranged in clay vases. Every inch of the room reflected her quiet determination. From outside, the transformation could be seen. Where weeds once grew wild, Amara planted flowers in rows, their bright petals turning the guest house into a little garden of joy. Children passing by would stop at the gate and stare, whispering to each other, "Who lives there now? It looks like a palace." Even some of the neighbors began to nod in admiration whenever they walked past. Though her in-laws still looked down on her, Amara felt different inside. She no longer carried herself like the rejected wife forced into a corner. She walked with her head high, her ankara gowns flowing, her geli tied boldly. She had turned shame into beauty, and her little home had begun to shine so brightly that it drew eyes from afar. What the family thought was punishment had become her crown, and soon the world outside the mansion would start to end. Amara's transformation did not end with the guest house. It began to show in her own spirit. Each morning she rose early, bathed in the cool water she fetched herself, and dressed with care. She no longer wore her clothes in haste or with the weight of shame on her shoulders. Instead, she chose her finest Iziagu gowns, their bold lion patterns standing out proudly against her smooth skin. She tied her geli high and firm, like a crown resting on her head. The same woman who once walked timidly into the mansion now stepped out of her little guest house with the grace of a queen. When she carried water across the compound or walked to the market, her posture was straight, her eyes calm, and her steps steady. She no longer hurried past people or bowed her head under whispers. Even the workers in the compound began to notice. "Madame Amara carries herself like royalty," the gardener murmured one morning, as he watched her greet him kindly while balancing a basket of yams on her hip. It wasn't just her appearance that changed, it was her presence. She spoke gently but firmly, smiled when others expected her to frown, and carried an aura that made people pause. Visitors who came to the mansion often found their eyes drawn toward her instead of the large house. There was something magnetic about the way she stood, the way she glowed with quiet dignity despite being pushed aside. Her in-laws pretended not to see it, but deep down they felt it. The shift in the air, the silent strength that Amara now radiated. Even in the smallest space of the compound, she commanded more respect than the ones living in the mansion. The guest house had become her throne, and she, the woman they once humiliated, had become the true queen of the compound. Shall I move on and expand Scene 9? The ex's jealousy, 350 words. In the same powerful cinematic style? Chisholm had grown comfortable in the main house, acting as though she still belonged there. She lounged in the sitting room in her fitted lace gowns, sipping juice while the family praised her cooking, her laughter, her poise. She was used to being the star, the woman everyone admired. But slowly, she began to notice something that unsettled her. Visitors who came to the compound no longer spoke only about the mansion's marble pillars or wide balconies. Their eyes often drifted toward the small guest house at the far end of the yard, glowing with flowers and life. One afternoon, a neighbor's wife stopped by with her children. After greeting the family politely, she leaned closer to Chisholm's mother-in-law and whispered, "That guest house is beautiful. Who fixed it up like that?" Chisholm's ears burned as she heard her mother-in-law mutter reluctantly, "It's Amara." Later that evening, another visitor walked straight past the main house to admire the rows of hibiscus Amara had planted, saying loudly, "This place feels more alive than the mansion itself." Chisholm forced a smile, but inside, envy twisted her heart. She could not understand how the same woman they mocked and pushed into the corner had turned that dusty, rotten place into something so admired. Every time Amara stepped out in her bold Isiagu gowns, her geli tied like a crown, people looked at her with respect. Chisholm noticed it. She saw how the guards greeted Amara warmly, how even strangers asked about her with curiosity. Late at night, as Chisholm sat in the grand bedroom that had once given her satisfaction, she felt restless. The golden curtains no longer made her feel powerful. Instead, they reminded her of what Amara had built from nothing. Envy settled in her chest like a heavy stone. She could not accept that the woman they tried to humiliate was now the one people admired. And though she smiled in public, behind her painted lips, her heart burned with jealousy that refused to let her rest. Do I? One quiet evening after a long day at work, Chaik decided to walk toward the guest house where Amara had been staying. For weeks, he had barely paid attention, brushing off her silence and convincing himself she was fine. But that night something tugged at his heart. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, and a soft glow spilled from the small guest house windows. Curious, he pushed the door open. The sight before him made him freeze. This was no longer the dusty, abandoned place he remembered. The walls had been repainted in soft cream and gold, shining gently under the glow of golden lamps. Handmade Ankara curtains danced with the evening breeze, and fresh flowers filled the air with sweet fragrance. A carved wooden table stood neatly in the center, polished until it gleamed, while cushions lined the chairs with bright, inviting colors. Even the bed, once torn and dirty, now looked like it belonged in a queen's chamber. The room radiated warmth, peace, and dignity, things the mansion with all its wealth could not provide. Chaik's eyes widened as he slowly stepped inside. He felt like a stranger in a palace, except this palace had been created by the very woman they had rejected. Amara stood at the corner, dressed in a flowing Isiagu gown, her geli high and regal, arranging fresh lilies in a clay vase. She looked up and their eyes met. For a moment he was speechless. This was not the broken wife he had abandoned to humiliation. This was a woman who had risen from pain and carved beauty out of rejection. "Amara," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. He wanted to apologize, to speak, to explain, but the words refused to form. Amara only smiled softly, her posture calm, her eyes steady. She didn't need to say anything. The room itself told the story. Her story of strength, dignity, and quiet victory. And in that moment Chaik finally realized the truth. The real queen of the compound was not in the mansion. She was Rig. The change in the compound could no longer be ignored. Every time relatives came to visit, their eyes drifted toward the guest house, no matter how hard they tried to hide it. What used to be a forgotten corner now looked like the heart of the home. The flowers Amara had planted bloomed in bright colors, the curtains glowed through the windows, and the air around it seemed alive with peace. Slowly, whispers began to spread among the family members who once mocked her. "Anon, can you see the guest house?" One aunt murmured quietly to another during a weekend gathering. "It looks finer than the mansion itself." The other aunt shook her head, her voice low. "This girl is not ordinary. We thought she would suffer there. But look how she turned shame into glory." Even those who once called her too simple could not deny it anymore. The contrast was too sharp. The mansion, though big, felt cold and heavy, while Amara's little house radiated warmth and elegance. Guests who came often preferred to linger near her side, drawn by the comfort of her space and the quiet strength she carried. The family felt the sting of embarrassment, though they refused to admit it openly. Her mother-in-law, who had proudly handed Chisholm the master bedroom, now avoided looking at the guest house for too long. She would clear her throat, adjust her wrapper, and change the topic whenever anyone praised Amara. The sisters-in-law who once laughed at her, now watched her with uneasy eyes, realizing she had gained something they couldn't take away, respect. Amara noticed their whispers, but she didn't boast. She continued living gracefully, moving about with her geli tied high, her laughter soft but strong. She had built dignity where they expected disgrace, and that quiet victory pierced deeper than any insult she could have thrown back at them. And as the days passed, the shame of the family grew heavier. They had tried to push her down, yet she had risen so high that their own mansion-s. The compound was alive with activity that Saturday afternoon. A big family celebration was underway, with relatives arriving from different towns and important guests pulling up in sleek cars. The mansion had been polished for the occasion, tables set, decorations hanging, and music playing softly from the speakers. But when the guests settled in, something unexpected happened. Their eyes kept straying toward the far end of the yard, where Amara's guest house stood in quiet beauty. The flowers she had planted swayed gently in the breeze, the curtains glowed through the open windows, and the sound of her soft humming drifted out like a song carried by the wind. One elder cleared his throat and said, "With all respect, can we sit in that smaller house? There's something warm about it." Heads nodded in agreement. Before anyone from the main mansion could protest, the guests rose and began walking toward Amara's space. When they entered, their faces lit up. The golden lamps glowed warmly, the air smelled of fresh hibiscus, and handmade cushions lined the seats. Amara, dressed in a royal blue Isiagu gown with a geli wrapped like a crown, welcomed them with grace. Soon laughter filled the little house. Drums from the young boys in the neighborhood beat joyfully outside, and women clapped as they sang traditional songs. Children danced on the veranda, their feet raising tiny clouds of dust, while elders nodded in admiration. Meanwhile, the main mansion sat in silence. Plates of food remained untouched, and the air felt heavy with embarrassment. Chisholm, sitting in the master bedroom, heard the echo of music and laughter drifting from Amara's palace, and her face tightened with envy. The in-laws exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that what they meant as humiliation had turned into glory. Amara's little house had become the heart of the celebration. Guests praised her taste, her strength, and her spirit. And as the evening sun dipped behind the compound walls, the celebration had barely ended when the bitterness inside the mansion boiled over. That evening, as the last guests drove away, Chisholm stormed into the courtyard with her geli tilted from anger. The in-laws gathered around her, their voices sharp with irritation. "So this is how it is now," one sister-in-law sneered. "Visitors ignoring the mansion and running to that tiny house?" Another added, "She thinks she is a queen just because she decorated a small room." Their words cut through the air like knives. Chisholm stepped forward, her eyes burning with envy. "Amara," she said loudly, making sure everyone could hear, "don't fool yourself. A guest house will always be a guest house. You can hang all the curtains you want, but it will never make you more important than this family." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the relatives, and a few chuckled cruelly, waiting to see Amara break down. But Amara did not flinch. She stood tall at the doorway of her little house, the evening breeze lifting the edge of her flowing Isiagu gown. Her geli was tied perfectly, shining like a crown under the moonlight. She looked at them calmly, her eyes steady, her voice low but strong. "Respect," she began, pausing long enough for silence to fall across the compound, "is not about the size of the room. It is about the strength of the woman who lives in it." Her words carried like thunder. The compound grew still, even the crickets seemed to pause. Amara's dignity filled the air, and for the first time, the in-laws felt the weight of their own cruelty. Chisholm's smile faltered, her confidence shaken by Amara's calmness. Amara didn't shout, she didn't beg, she simply spoke truth, and in that truth, she rose higher than all their insults. She turned and walked back into her glowing guest house, leaving them speechless in the night. That moment became the turning point. The moment the family realized that no matter what they said, Amara's quiet strength could not be destroyed. The gossip in Wafer spread faster than Harmattan fire. Everyone had heard about the guest house that outshined a mansion, and the family felt the sting of shame. Relatives who once laughed behind Amara's back now walked with their heads bowed when neighbors whispered, "Isn't that the house where the bride made beauty from rejection?" The humiliation became too heavy, and soon, a family meeting was called inside the big mansion. Chike's mother cleared her throat nervously. Amara, my daughter, you know you are our wife. It is not right for you to stay outside like a stranger. Come back to the main house. That is where you belong. Chisholm sat stiffly at the corner, her lips pressed tight, her eyes avoiding Amara's gaze. A few others nodded quickly, eager to erase the embarrassment their gossip had caused. But Amara simply smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep peace. She was dressed in a rich red lace gown with golden earrings that caught the light, her presence glowing brighter than the chandelier above them. Thank you, she said softly, her voice steady. But I am already home. The place you gave me in rejection has now become my palace. I don't need the mansion to prove my worth. Her words sank into the silence like a heavy stone into still water. The family members shifted uneasily, ashamed of the very treatment that had led her to this moment of strength. Chike looked at her with new eyes, realizing his wife had risen above them all without bitterness, without noise, only with quiet dignity. That night, when Amara returned to her guest house, the lanterns glowed warmly, the curtains swayed in the breeze, and the compound seemed to bow to her grace. She had turned pain into power, rejection into beauty, and by choosing her palace over their mansion, she showed them all that dignity does not come from walls of marble, but from the spirit of the woman who carries it. Do you want me to now write the final scene 15? The story that echoed 350 war. All over Nwafor, Amara's story spread like a sweet song carried by the wind. At the market, women whispered it as they bargained for tomatoes. At the salons, her name came up between laughter and braiding. Even at the roadside food stalls, men shook their heads in awe and said, "That woman turned rejection into royalty." They spoke of how she was pushed out of the mansion like an unwanted guest, only to turn the forgotten guest house into a palace brighter than the main home. They told of how she carried herself with dignity, never raising her voice, never losing her grace, yet proving to everyone that true power is silent, steady, and unshakable. Children began to sing little rhymes about the queen of the guest house, and elders used her name in advice, saying, "Be like Amara, turn pain into beauty." She had become more than a wife in a difficult family. She had become a symbol, a living lesson in strength and patience. In the end, Amara did not just change a small house. She changed the hearts of people who saw her story as a reminder that dignity is not given. It is built, it is carried, and it shines brightest in the darkest places. Her tale lived on not as gossip but as inspiration. Would you like me to now combine all 15 parts into one continuous full script, about 4,000 plus words, in the same emotional and viral style, so you have the complete story in one flow?